Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs program at the crossroads of religion and life, a series highlighting the cultural and social interaction between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTVC. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
Hello, I'm Barbara Holmes, your host for today's Austin Faith Dialogue. I'm a staff member at St. John's United Methodist Church and hosting today's program on behalf of Austin Metropolitan Ministries. Some remarkably hopeful events have occurred in this global village of ours in the last year or so. Changes in the governing policies of the Soviet Union have resulted in newfound freedoms. Reunification of Germany is in process. We hear daily of the reduction of weaponry and military spending in this country and in this community. Today we will visit with longtime advocates of the peace movement about these world events that have an effect on us right here in Austin. And I'm so happy to introduce to you these guests today. Richard Dietz is a traveler, and Richard, we're awfully happy to have you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Richard is the director of Interfaith Activities for the Fellowship of Reconciliation, an international organization with offices in New York. But you've been in Austin, and how pleased we are you could be with us and be here for the show.
Thank you.
Mary Berwick is a longtime Austin activist in peace activities, a member of St. Austin's Catholic Church, and so pleased that you could take time to be with us, Mary. And you know, I don't think I've ever said to you how much I appreciate your commitment and your tireless efforts to the peace movement. Peace with Justice has been something you've dedicated a lot of your time and energy. And for a lot of us, I want to say thank you.
Thank you, Barbara.
It's a pleasure to have you here. And Richard, you have traveled all over the world, but you're a native Texan. And I need to ask, what is a Texan like you doing workshops in South Africa and leading delegations to the USSR? How did that big leap happen?
Well, I was born in Big Spring, Texas, and when I was in college, that was in the days when the Civil Rights Movement was just beginning, and that opened my vision toward the wider world. And then a particular person came to our campus, Muriel Lester, who was traveling for the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, and she talked about the global vision of reconciliation and peace with justice, and that ignited a fire in my life that's never stopped.
And you have been with the fellowship for about 18 years
Yes.
now, a long time. So that's taken you all over the world, and you're an ordained clergy?
Yes, the United Methodist Church.
Well, we're happy that you've come back to where your roots are. And Mary, tell us a little about the occasion that brought Richard here.
Well, we heard, I think it was from Bill and Lib Harris, that Richard was going to be in San Antonio. Were you giving a talk in San
Yes.
Antonio? Yes, that Richard was going to be in San Antonio, and for those of us who had either read his articles in Fellowship magazine or have heard him speak before, it seemed too good an opportunity to miss, to have him come up to Austin. And there are a number of people in Austin who are members, individual members of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, but we've never had a fellowship, an FOR chapter here. There have been efforts to form an interfaith peace chapter, and way back about 8 years ago we had an Austin Interfaith Peace Network, which was very active for a few years. But the FOR is dear to many of us, and the principles and the purpose of nonviolent change and the following of the principles of Gandhi and Martin Luther King. So we thought, why don't we get this mailing list of all these people and invite them to come here, Richard? And we were very fortunate. The LBJ School of Public Affairs lent us the Bass Lecture Hall. They co-sponsored it. The Peace and Justice Committee of Austin Metropolitan Ministries, and I'm a member of that committee, and other people on the committee, Frank Wright and others, sort of set up, did the publicity, and set up Richard's coming here. So last night we had a meeting which was well attended, and Richard gave us lots of insights both into what the travels he has been on, and also his perceptions of non-violence sort of breaking out in many parts of the world, as opposed to the pictures we always think of the violence that is so prevalent.
Well, since you were able to bring him here, what do you think will be the outcome of the people that attended? You said there'd never been a formal chapter. Is that really the goal, to get a chapter started?
Well, it would be nice. I think we did not set ourselves up deliberately any particular goal. When you with something like this, it's very often people who are already involved in different issues or different activities who are the catalysts for getting something together. But we really we need to feel that there are other people out there to whom this would perhaps be their one action that they would do for the peace movement in Austin, to establish a chapter of FOR. And the people who were there last night left their names, addresses, and telephone numbers, and I know we will contact them again. And FOR is celebrating its 75th anniversary, and I want Richard to be the main speaker about all that sort of stuff. But it would be great if we could say that we would honor that
for a birthday
event.
Present.
Exactly.
Yes, to have a chapter started here.
So we don't know what will happen. Certainly those of us who were there will, keep in touch with each other.
But the description movement is more accurate than organization, so that you can move in the direction that it leads.
Yes, yes.
And you've used the term FOR. We've said Fellowship of Reconciliation. You touched a little bit on its goal, but Richard, that may not be an organization that is that widely known. And tell us a little about what the Fellowship of Reconciliation is.
Well, we are the oldest peace organization in the United States. We began 75 years ago. The beginning was in Europe 76 years ago on the eve of World War I. As the war was breaking out, a German Lutheran and a British Quaker at a conference that was called to try to stop the war from breaking out, and the war actually started during the conference in 1914. This German Lutheran and English Quaker said, we are not going to be enemies even though our nations are now at war with one another, and we want to start a fellowship that will transcend the nation state and this imaginary line that we call a boundary. And that was the humble beginning many years ago, and today we have chapters in about 40 countries, and we are committed to what Dr. King called the beloved community, of trying to build a global family through nonviolent means, to do away with violence and rancor and hatred, and where there is oppression and injustice and prejudice, to find nonviolent means of transforming those unjust situations and bringing about a larger measure of justice, peace, and freedom.
When I think about the hot spots that exist today, and we hear about them and read about them in the news, you just can't walk into a situation like that. How do you get in a position where you can work with leaders or to diffuse a situation? Give us some examples of, I know you've been to the Philippines, Korea, Europe. Give us an example of how you might, do they invite you or call the Fellowship of Reconciliation in to be a part of that?
Yes. For example, toward the end of the Marcos era in the Philippines, when people were calling Marcos the Hitler of Southeast Asia, and many people were saying the only way to get rid of a dictator like this is by a violent uprising that would overthrow his government, a group of nuns who were working with the poor in Manila, called the Little Sisters of Jesus, heard about the work that our organization was doing in Europe and in other countries, and they sent out a call to the International Fellowship to send some trainers to the Philippines. And these nuns raised the money.
Now let me just interrupt to say, to send some trainers?
Yes.
Trainers meaning?
A couple who are experienced in training people in nonviolent social change and resisting oppression.
On the scene where that is happening?
Yes. And so a couple Hildegard Gosmeyer and her husband, Jean Gos, went to the Philippines under the sponsorship of the Catholic Church, and that resulted in 6 weeks of workshops, mainly in the Catholic community, and then I went a few months later and did 3 weeks of workshop among Protestants. And out of those 9 weeks of workshops, a group of people were trained in resisting oppression through nonviolent means. And it was because of an invitation that came from a group of nuns that bishops and priests and ministers and nuns and deaconesses and lay people began working toward the kind of change that actually eventually did happen. They were not, of course, the only ones. They were part of a wider movement. But there is growing in the world today an awareness that nonviolence can topple dictators and transform situations that are thought to be impossibly corrupt or oppressively stultifying, and that no change is possible. And yet, as we've seen in Eastern Europe in the past year, many times the impossible does happen, and it happens peacefully rather than violently.
That is truly inspiring, isn't it?
I'd love to ask just one question there, but it would be so hard in such a short conversation that we are having. But just for our listeners to give some idea of what in 6 weeks and 9 weeks one learns in a training session. I mean, a whole lot of different people come in who might feel, as I know, we can all feel that we're peaceably inclined or we wish to be peaceful. But of course, facing a moment of tension, a moment of fear, a moment of violence, how can I so train myself that my gut reaction of lashing out or of violence will not occur? So when you talk about this training, can you give some idea of, what one trains in?
Yes. Well, it really goes back to the insights that Gandhi fashioned out of the freedom struggle in India. Gandhi said the strongest power in the world is truth. He said God is truth and truth is God. And that people who are armed with truth and who persist in that struggle with only the weapon of truth are actually invincible in the struggle against falsehood and injustice. And he trained Indian people to stand up against the British Empire nonviolently through fasts, through marches, through rallies, through education, through symbolic action, through a constructive program. And what nonviolence workshops attempt to do is to analyze a particular situation, say what are the strengths and the weaknesses of the oppressor and of the opposition, and then actually do training in nonviolent resistance and transformation. And there is a growing body of understanding that's growing out of the struggles of the freedom movement in India, the civil rights movement in the South, the movement that just overthrew Pinochet in Chile, now the movements in Eastern Europe, in Brazil, the movement of the peasants for land, in Argentina, the movement against the military junta by the mothers of the disappeared. There is an amazing growth of nonviolent transformation that many times we miss on the evening news or in the daily newspaper. But I think it holds the clue to the future of our global village.
And our living together and surviving.
Yes.
The topic of your presentation here in Austin was new forms of nonviolence. Was that part of what you talked about when you were with the group here?
Yes. And for example, many people, when they think of revolution, they think of guerrillas taking up arms and fleeing into the hills and then coming down and trying to defeat the opponent's army. Last year, the world was focused on Tiananmen Square in China, yes, where for weeks and weeks, unarmed students stood before the world's largest country, demanding freedom, an end to corruption, democratization in that country. And many people say, well, the students were crushed on June 4th, and that proves that nonviolence doesn't work. But it's interesting because there are violent struggles against oppression that go on for 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years. And usually people don't say when these movements are defeated, that proves that violence doesn't work. What they say is, well, they just need to keep working and they'll finally win. And what happened with the Chinese, they did suffer a defeat. But people on the scene in China today say the students have not lost the final battle because they are determined to bring democratization to their country. And to me, the amazing period that we're in today is a period where democracy is sweeping the globe, and in the great majority of places, it comes through nonviolent means.
Well, as you talk about democracy sweeping the globe, I don't know how in the world we can even keep up with the changes in Europe. You have been in and out of the USSR a number of times. You've led peace delegates as late as last year.
As late as April of this year.
Of this year.
Yes.
So just a few weeks ago.
Yes.
From your times in and out and your contacts there and what you have seen and experienced, were you prepared for the dramatic changes that have come about?
I don't think anyone was.
Well, what do you attribute that to? You say democracy is sweeping, and so I'm trying to get at what has caused this uprising, this outbreak of peace?
Well, I think it's not easy to give a short, simple answer. I think there are many factors. I think religiously I'd have to say that this is a kairos moment in history, that the Spirit of God is working in a mysterious way to bring liberation to the human family. I think that a clue is given to us in President Eisenhower, who, as he was going out of office, said, someday the peoples of the world are going to want peace so much that the governments are going to have to get out of their way and let them have it. Over the last 10 years or so, there has developed a what we call citizen diplomacy, where American and Soviet citizens have been determined not to treat one another as the enemy, have been determined to get together and to find ways of breaking through and breaking down the Cold War. And we believe that that helped set the climate out of which one of the, perhaps the greatest or one of the greatest political leaders of this century, Gorbachev, came to power. And he is a truly remarkable person, but he's not the only one. He's part of a new generation of leadership that is moving out of the old bureaucratic, centralized dictatorship that developed under Lenin and Stalin. And he's part of a new transformation that's taking place there. And he unleashed from the top a democratic revolution that has now been responded to by grassroots development of literally tens of thousands of new organizations in the Soviet Union, plus in Eastern Europe, which happened even more quickly there than happened in the Soviet Union.
And talk about that. The Berlin Wall coming down, I remember a little of just the despair. I can recreate some of those feelings I felt when that wall was put up. And you have here a piece of what was that horrid edifice.
No more powerful symbol of the Cold War and the hostility east and west than this wall. And the day it was breached peacefully, there was not a person killed in Germany. Chancellor Kohl paid tribute to the first nonviolent revolution in German history. The day it was breached, I wrote to a friend of mine who's a pastor in West Berlin and head of our West German FOR branch in Berlin, and I said, Uli, send me a piece of the wall. And he chipped this off and sent it to me. And I had just received a month earlier at a conference I attended in Moscow a piece of the first nuclear weapon in history to be peacefully disarmed as a result of the Reagan-Gorbachev treaty, in which the INF, the intermediate range nuclear weapons, are to be disarmed. The Soviet Union destroyed the first, and then the U.S. followed, and they are destroying this whole class of weapons. And so this is a part of that first weapon that was destroyed in the Soviet Union. So what better symbols of a nonviolent revolution in which we are living right now? We will tell our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, we were alive in 1989 and 90 when these changes took place.
And that is really making your point that the dust and rocks that are there now, there was no bloodshed, there were no riots, there was no firing of weapons, and yet literal transformation has occurred.
The new president of Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel, less than a year ago was in prison.
Yes, yes.
He is today the president of Czechoslovakia. He calls what happened there the Velvet Revolution. Again, there were not people killed. There were students who went out on the street and who simply demanded an end to that tyranny in that country. And it collapsed of its own dead weight.
Well, it's not often that we can be a part of these kind of dramatic events, history happening literally on the evening television news before our eyes. And yet those of you who have been working for 20 years, going to meetings, passing out flyers, you've had a part of that.
And let me just say that in terms of the third world, there is a movement toward democracy in many countries. And if our country would put into practice our affirmations about democracy and extend in places like Guatemala and El Salvador and Nicaragua and the Philippines, not low-intensity conflict, not exporting of weaponry, not training people in the ways of death and destruction, but our own belief in democracy. This is what the world is seeking, and if we would extend not military aid, but the principles of our own democratic heritage, I believe that we would help continue to tip the scales against tyranny and the death squads and the violence which has been so great in this century toward a peaceful evolution of the human family.
And those situations, particularly in Central and South America, those religious folks have done a lot in the grassroots, in that the base communities, the biblical liberation that they have realized, that ferment is there. And that's why I asked a while ago, how do you get in those hot spots? Because if there was ever a place where the strategies that you're talking about, nonviolence, and the education that takes place, it could make a lot of difference in that situation also.
Just one quick example. In Chile, there is a nonviolent movement there called SERPAZ, Servicio Paz y Justicia, Service for Peace and Justice. And under the Pinochet dictatorship, they did workshops in nonviolence. They did workshops in overcoming fear. Because one of the greatest problems under a tyranny is the fear that people have of speaking their minds, of saying no to the dictatorship. And when Pinochet called an election, they carried out these workshops and helped to mobilize the population to actually vote out of power Pinochet, something people thought would never happen to a dictator who controlled the press and who controlled the army and who controlled the economy. And yet the people, what the Filipinos call people power was stronger than all of the power that Pinochet could muster.
And the violence that was represented by the government, the military forces, and that kind of thing. So that's just something I'd like to touch on briefly, in that all of this impinges on our daily lives, and a lot of my concern is about just the climate of violence that we live in. You don't have to look at the news. Look at the football field, look at movies, look at fine arts. We are saturated by it. Are there some practical suggestions that you all could give us about helping raise consciousness to be nonviolent instead of in traffic or in schools, to have a nonviolent approach as opposed to physical power and the use of fear? How can we change the climate we live in 25 words or less? Mary, have you any thoughts about practical ways that we can help de-escalate just automatic violence?
Oh, it's such a biggie. I do think that you've hit on something, though, which is, of course, education and child rearing and parenting and dealing with, I mean, the peace begins at home, and children learn how to deal with their own fears and their own angers, you know, in positive ways, if it's role modeled for them. if the model is violent, that's where they learn it. And I think that we have a long way to go in this country in helping, really helping parents and helping what we might call the dysfunctional family deal in early stages with everything that does promote then the violent response. I know in schools, I mean from teachers whom I know and whom I've taught with, and I've been a school principal, that there are wonderful models, curriculum models and classroom models for problem solving, for discussing conflict, for resolving conflicts on the playground non-violently. And children are wonderful themselves at thinking of creative ways. A whole new imagination and creativity is needed in the whole problem-solving procedure, and it's being done.
Yes, there is, you know, a growing movement of conflict resolution, of workshops in schools, of teaching kids how to deal with conflict in a peaceful way. There's the growth in many colleges and in many communities where they're teaching mediation skills to people. In New York State, they have just established the Martin Luther King Institute of Nonviolence, where police officers, employees in prisons, school teachers, people all across the board are being trained in nonviolent ways of dealing with conflict.
Well, it is inspiring to hear that there is hope. The oppressed people are finally realizing some freedom, and that we can all do something. All of us have realized God's grace in our lives and know how liberating that is, and we can wish and work for that for others. We need to conclude for today and want to express a special appreciation to our guests, Richard Dietz and Mary Berwick, and invite you to join us again next week at the same time for Austin Faith Dialogue. Good day.
For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries at 472